The galaxy had never discovered how to rule itself, and after enough failed attempts, it had stopped pretending that such a discovery was waiting just over the next diplomatic horizon. There were leagues and accords and emergency compacts. There were trade webs older than some suns had planets. There were languages designed specifically for negotiation, taxonomies for insult, ritualized exchanges of hostages, and inherited obligations that could send grain to worlds no living citizen had ever seen. There were local hegemonies and temporary coalitions, and 1,000 beautiful political machines that all worked until ambition or fear or simple distance broke them apart. There was no council, no senate, no throne, no official center of gravity. There was only conversation. Not peaceful conversation, not always reasonable conversation, but conversation all the same. Civilizations argued their way into coexistence because exterminating one another was expensive, and because interstellar logistics had a talent for humiliating grand ambitions. Most wars were short or local, not because anyone was especially wise, but because projecting power across a spiral arm was harder than rhetoric made it sound. So the galaxy survived by memory and reputation. And among the oldest reputations was humanity. Humans were difficult to define in the way one defines younger powers. They did not possess a neatly bounded territory that others could point to on a star map and say there, that is where they begin, and there, that is where they end. Human systems certainly existed by the thousands, but humanity had also seeded itself through habitats in the dark between stars, through shared stations, through cooperative rings built above alien worlds, through shipyards that served everyone and formally belonged to no one. If one wanted to track their presence, one had to stop thinking in borders and start thinking in traces. A transport route stabilized after a near-relativistic debris storm. A plague burned out faster than expected because unfamiliar medics arrived with suspiciously advanced tools and no invoices. A failing orbital spine around a poor mining moon was reinforced with materials no one there could have afforded, and the engineers who did it left behind only maintenance diagrams written in 6 languages. Humans fixed things. They traded, they listened, they volunteered, they disappeared. Most species had a story about them. A human technician who worked barehanded in freezing wind because a power relay needed reseating, and it was faster than waiting for drones. A human teacher who stayed through a famine. A human freighter captain who refused to abandon refugees even when the equation said she should. Many found them admirable, others found them irritating, quite a few found them eerie. It was not normal, after all, for a civilization that old to be so restrained. At a traffic exchange built inside the hollowed shell of a captured comet, a group of traders once argued for 13 standard hours over a cargo insurance dispute before the conversation, as such conversations often did, turned to humans. "They are declining," said a scaled broker, whose people considered visible ambition the only trustworthy measure of health. "No species grows quiet by choice." "They are not quiet," replied an avian navigator, adjusting the feathers along her throat. "They are selective. They build infrastructure and refuse the authority that naturally comes with it," the broker said. "That is either hypocrisy or weakness." A scholar from a species with translucent skin swirled nutrient gel in a cup and said, "Or confidence. Confidence leads to display. Not if display became unnecessary a very long time ago." That silenced the table for a moment. Finally, a freighter pilot with one mechanical eye said, "My grandmother used to say there are only 2 reasons an old predator lies down in plain sight. Either it is dying, or it has forgotten what fear feels like." No one much liked that thought. The conversation returned to insurance. Far away, in the warm abundance of human space, humanity itself would have admitted to a different problem. It had not become weak. It had become tired. For so long humanity had imagined that the conquest of scarcity would feel like transcendence. For centuries, then millennia, It had poured brilliance into survival. It had learned to eat suns in measured sips, to draw energy from fusion gardens and vacuum asymmetries, and the labor of engineered singularities that purred in cages of light. It had built ring habitats so broad that weather moved across them like memory. It had solved material wants so thoroughly that poverty survived mostly as historical reenactment or aesthetic experiment. It had made disease rare, aging negotiable, education universal, travel ordinary. This was supposed to be victory. Instead, it had become atmosphere, invisible, inescapable. In orbital cities wrapped around stars like jeweled bracelets, humans lived under curated dawns and programmed bird calls. They wandered through museums the size of mountain ranges, through gardens designed by minds that could simulate evolution for pleasure, through districts where gravity shifted by artistic intention. They loved, created, studied, drifted, changed careers a dozen times, learned extinct instruments, forgot old grudges, reinvented cuisine, resurrected ecosystems, and still, beneath all that abundance, many of them felt a small and persistent hollowness. The old problems had shaped the species. Without them, shape itself became harder to hold. One could hear it in ordinary conversation. Two men stood on a transparent balcony overlooking a city that spiraled for hundreds of kilometers around the inner curve of a habitat ring. Below them, floating light displays marked the opening of a new public archive containing reconstructed sensory recordings from prehistoric Earth. Crowds moved like schools of color beneath the glass. "It's beautiful," one of the men said. "It is." "You sound unconvinced." "I'm tired of beautiful things." The other laughed, but softly because he understood. "Then what do you want?" The first man took longer than he should have to answer. "I want something to matter before I decide that it does." Across human civilization, that sentiment appeared in 10,000 variations. Some reacted by diving deeper into art or philosophy, some into engineered danger. There were entire subcultures devoted to curated hardship. People crossed storm oceans in reconstructed wooden ships, navigated by stars when they could have folded space around themselves and arrived in comfort. They climbed mountains without safety fields. They limited their own access to medicine. They entered simulations of ancient uncertainty, where jobs could be lost, and debts could crush, and one bad year could alter a life. They did these things not because they were foolish, but because consequence had become exotic. A minority rejected the whole architecture of convenience more systematically. They became known, loosely and without central organization, as hand workers. Different communities had different names, but that was the one that stuck in the galaxy because it translated well. Hand workers left the densest human worlds and went outward, not to conquer or administer, but to do useful labor in ways that reintroduced friction to existence. They farmed with alien communities that still preferred local methods over full automation. They repaired seawalls, patched hulls, taught in person, practiced medicine with tools that demanded skill rather than intention. They chose contact over abstraction, effort over elegance. "Meaning lives in friction" was the closest thing they had to a shared motto, though most of them hated mottos. On a humid agricultural world called Iliad by its native inhabitants, and nothing at all by any larger polity, because it was strategically irrelevant, a human woman named Mara spent 6 months helping build flood terraces after seasonal storms grew erratic. The Iliadi grew food in stepped wetlands shimmering with bacterial light, and their hands, branching at the wrist into delicate triple grips, could shape mud and stone with a speed that fascinated her. At night she would sit with local families, exhausted down into the bones in a way she had not felt since youth, and listen to the insects sing. One evening, an elderly farmer asked why a being from a civilization that could rearrange asteroids and cool stars with engineered veils had come all this way to carry wet stone in the rain. Mara considered lying. She could have said solidarity, she could have said service. Both would have been true. Instead, she said, "Because I sleep better when I'm tired for a reason I can touch." The farmer clicked his jaw ridges in a gesture that approximated understanding. "Then, perhaps your people have too much comfort." Perhaps. Humanity's war fleets, meanwhile, slept. That too made the galaxy uneasy when it remembered to think about it. Old military infrastructure remained scattered throughout human space, sometimes openly, sometimes hidden in the glare of stars or buried in ice around dead worlds. The fleets were not secret exactly. Ceremonial reviews were still held. Historical tours still moved through old carriers and siege hulks. Strategic academies still taught campaigns from eras when humanity had not yet learned moderation. But no one had seen those machines used in earnest for so long that younger civilizations increasingly treated them as cultural relics. Humanity had once fought like an apex species cornered by a hostile universe. The record of that survived, fragmented but persistent, in alien memory. There were stories of solar sieges and kinetic storms, of human stubbornness so ferocious that entire coalitions had exhausted themselves merely trying to understand it. But those stories belonged to another age, and most living beings, even long-lived ones, had known only the quieter humanity that built hospitals and refused formal dominion. That quiet humanity was what the Kelari chose to misread. The Kelari had risen in a system of brutal ecologies and had never managed to rid themselves of the conviction that hardship was a moral instrument. Their societies were organized around hierarchy, performance, and what they called natural pressure, a phrase that sounded cleaner in their language than it behaved in reality. They admired strength not merely as a survival trait but as an ethical proof. Compassion, to them, was tolerable only when wielded by winners, and even then only sparingly, as one might irrigate a controlled field. They had built a formidable regional power through disciplined expansion, military meritocracy, and a talent for absorbing weaker neighbors while rewriting their histories as acts of rescue. They were not fools. Their scientists were excellent, their fleets modern, their logistics sharp. But like many powers that succeed by force, they had developed a theory of the universe in which force explained more than it really did. Humanity offended that theory. Human influence was everywhere but intangible. Smaller species under human informal protection seemed more resilient than they ought to be. Economic stabilization measures encouraged by human trade networks made predatory acquisition slower, messier, politically complicated. Kelari strategists began to describe humanity not as a rival empire, but as a diffuse cultural suppressant, a civilizational dampener reducing the natural competitive tempo of the galaxy. In a war room suspended inside the armored core of a Kelari command habitat, senior planners gathered around a volumetric map of 3 sectors where human outreach activity had recently increased. The map glittered with shipping lanes, agricultural yields, demographic trends, projected unrest indexes. "They displace necessity," said one planner. "Wherever they become embedded, weaker species stop collapsing on schedule." A general with scar tissue fused into ornate patterns along his throat said, "And in protecting weakness, they create inefficiency." "Worse," said another, "they normalize inefficiency as virtue." Their highest commander listened without interruption. He was older than most at the table, his face marked not by ceremonial alteration but by age left mostly unsoftened. When the others were done, he asked a simple question. If they still possess force, why do they not use it? No one answered immediately. At length one strategist said, "Because force is expensive." Another said, "Because their society has softened beyond the appetite for sacrifice." A third said, "Because they fear what they once were." The commander studied the map. "Then we will learn which answer is correct." They chose targets not for strategic value but for symbolic leverage. Worlds and stations where human hand workers had become beloved fixtures. Communities improved by decades of quiet human labor. Places too small to justify massive military attention, too distant from major powers to expect immediate rescue, too intertwined with human sentiment to be ignored. The design of the atrocity reflected Kelari doctrine. It was to be didactic, demonstrative, an argument made through suffering. They would not simply massacre. Massacres were common enough. They would reveal vulnerability and discredit human softness simultaneously. On Iliad, where Mara had once shaped flood terraces with wet stone and aching shoulders, the first signs came in the water. The irrigation channels began carrying a sheen that local sensors did not recognize. By the time warning spread, it was already in the wetlands, in the amphibious crops, in the skin of animals. The compound did not kill quickly. It attacked future generations, scrambling reproductive chemistry across a dozen compatible species, including human baseline biology. Panic hit not because bodies were falling in the fields, but because every medical scan whispered the same future. Sterility. At almost the same moment, Kelari ships appeared above the planet and disabled satellites, communication relays, and power transfer arrays with surgical accuracy. Transport hubs were hit next, not destroyed outright, disabled, trapped. Medical archives were corrupted by tailored bursts that shredded stored diagnostics without harming physical structures. Cultural vaults, some of them little more than community memory repositories, were atomized in deliberate sequence and rebroadcast on public frequencies. On another world, a teaching station staffed by 8 humans and hundreds of local educators was open to vacuum after external locks were fused and internal pressure systems sabotaged. On a moon with no strategic significance, Kelari Marines burned seed banks in sight of the cameras before executing the curators. On a river world where human biologists had spent decades helping restore a collapsing ecosystem, orbital beams sliced through water purification towers one by one, each collapse timed to coincide with the arrival of civilian crowds seeking shelter. The broadcast spread faster than freight. Every major communications lattice carried some version of them within hours, not all in perfect fidelity because panic shreds bandwidth, but enough, more than enough. Humanity watched its volunteers die. Mara was not on Iliad when the attack began. She was on a sister world 3 systems away, sleeping in a prefabricated clinic after a 14-hour surgery cycle, assisting a species whose internal organs were arranged like braided sacks and made even routine medicine a slow study in humility. She woke to emergency alerts and spent the next 9 hours trying to reestablish links through Kelari suppression fields. When a signal finally punched through, it was not a stable feed. It was fragments, fire reflected in floodwater, someone shouting for pressure seals, a child crying in an Iliadi dialect she barely understood. Then the face of Terran, a human medic she knew from training exchanges, blood on his lips, one arm hanging wrong. He was in a storage dome that had been converted into an emergency ward. The gravity was failing in pulses, making bodies on gurneys drift and slap back down. Behind him, local volunteers moved between the injured with the frantic care of those who know the arithmetic is already against them. "If anyone gets this," Terran said, voice rough with smoke and strain, "help them. Don't just archive this, help them." Something struck the building hard enough to tilt the frame. Metal screamed. He closed his eyes for 1 second, opened them again, and said, quieter, "Please don't let this make us forget who we are." The recording cut. Across human space, billions heard those words before sleep or at work, or while walking under artificial skis that suddenly felt obscene in their serenity. There are societies in which public grief is always present just below the surface, because hardship never leaves long enough for forgetting. Humanity had not been one of them for a very long time. Tragedy still occurred, but dispersed, softened by scale and technology, caught by systems designed to prevent collapse. People died, yes, but usually not in ways that forced an entire civilization to look into the same wound at once. Now it did. Entire habitat cities fell silent. Music streams cut out as users stopped selecting new tracks. Public plazas filled without coordination. Emergency channels that had not seen serious use in generations became flooded with translation requests, volunteer offers, demands for information, promises of retaliation, prayers from religions some had half forgotten they still practiced. There was grief everywhere, true grief, sharp and helpless and sickening. And beneath it, like heat under ash, there was relief. It arrived in private first, a thought one hated even while thinking it, a shameful loosening in the chest, the unbearable and humiliating sensation of being awake. Something had happened. Something real. Something that could not be curated, postponed, aestheticized, or solved by 1,000 distributed comfort systems before breakfast. Reality had forced entry. History had returned from museum glass and struck the species across the face. In one apartment over a sea of lights, a composer watched the footage from Iliad 3 times in a row and then sat in stunned silence, realizing that the numbness she had mistaken for peace had cracked open. She hated herself for the sliver of clarity she felt inside the sorrow. On a recreational climbing platform, high inside a habitat cylinder, two friends who had spent the previous day simulating survival against engineered storms stood, clipped into safety lines, and stared at the sky-projected casualty estimates. "I feel terrible," one said. "So do I." "No, I mean I feel terrible and also," he swallowed, "also like I've been underwater for years and someone finally broke the surface." His friend stared at him, appalled because he understood exactly. This was the danger, not that grief was false. It was. It was as real as anything humanity had felt in centuries. The danger was that grief, meeting a civilization starved for urgency, found itself mixed with relief so potent it masqueraded as moral clarity. Networks filled with memorials, then anger, then arguments over what form action should take, then demands that action not be delayed by the usual deliberative caution. Histories were reread with new hunger. Ancient campaigns once discussed academically began circulating as inspiration. Old ship names trended again. Some of the loudest voices called for restraint and justice rather than revenge, but they found themselves drowned in an ocean of awakened purpose. To mourn in public increasingly meant to advocate. To advocate meant to escalate. Outrage became performance, and because performance was tied to genuine pain, it was difficult to criticize without sounding cruel. The message from Taran split human interpretation in two. "Please help them." That part everyone accepted. "Please don't let this make us forget who we are." That part became a battlefield. Some heard in it a plea for restraint. Others argued that true restraint would be to stop the Kalari forever. Some said the only way to honor the dead was to refuse hatred. Others replied that hatred was not the point, duty was, and if duty felt exhilarating, that did not make it impure. It is very easy, for a wounded civilization, to mistake emotional intensity for ethical truth. Humanity did not roar into mobilization. It narrowed. Trade routes shifted. Civilian fabrication arrays received sealed requisition updates. Strategic archives long maintained for continuity rather than expectation began streaming into active analysis queues. Dormant shipyards in the shadow of gas giants lit up one after another, their scaffolds unfolding like skeletal flowers. In system after system, old warships were brought out of ceremonial orbit and fitted not with modern ornaments but with the brutal practicalities of logistics, armor, and mass transfer capacity. Carriers that had spent centuries as museums were evacuated, restored, and loaded. Deep storage kinetic reserves were inventoried. Command AIs with ethical constraints layered over older, harsher cores were consulted again for the first time in generations. None of this caused panic inside human society. It caused focus. That was what unsettled alien observers who were close enough to notice. Human traffic did not become frantic. Civilian populations did not riot. There was no obvious central declaration. Instead, a diffuse civilization that had appeared dreamy and over-civilized only days before began moving with the terrible calm of something rediscovering an old posture. Kalari analysts watched the early signs and misunderstood them. "They are shocked," one said. "Of course they are," another replied. "That was the point. They will retaliate." "Yes, but carefully. Their society cannot absorb prolonged sacrifice. They have no recent appetite for it." A younger officer, less certain, asked, "What if the old appetite returns?" The room dismissed him, not because the question was irrational, but because it was inconvenient. The first human strike fell on a fleet assembly platform, orbiting a Kalari gas giant. There was no warning, no grand speech, no demand that civilians evacuate. Relativistic projectiles arrived so fast that the platform's defense network recorded impact almost simultaneously with detection. Dry docks opened like fruit under a hammer. Half-built warships tore loose from their moorings and spun into one another. Dockworkers, technicians, officers, and Marines all died together in the same widening cloud of metal and fire. Within minutes, jamming fields blinded nearby communications. Boarding craft emerged through the wreckage and secured control nodes with ruthless efficiency. It was, by any historical measure, a severe but still recognizable military strike. The next ones widened the circle. Shipyards went dark. Fuel reserves ignited. Defense grids across 4 systems failed under coordinated cyber and kinetic assault. Human fleets seized orbital dominance with an ease that shocked observers who had convinced themselves age implied softness. Kalari task groups that moved to contest them found themselves outranged, outtimed, and in some cases simply outthought by doctrines refined over centuries of simulation and updated in secret. Human officers were rusty only in the emotional sense. Their military machinery had slept, not decayed. The galaxy watched with a mix of awe and dread. Then the war shifted from defeat to dismantlement. That shift is where the human atrocities truly began. No one announced a policy of indiscriminate violence. Humans had laws, traditions, ethical schools, and distributed oversight mechanisms too elaborate to allow such a crude transformation openly. Instead, the slide happened through argument, through logic, through the ancient and always reusable reasoning that if the enemy's war capacity is embedded in society, then society itself becomes a valid target. Kalari urban systems were heavily integrated. Industrial districts touched residential sectors. Food production, transport, education, and military fabrication formed braided infrastructures designed for resilience. Human planners presented analyses showing that to end future threat, those braids had to be cut everywhere at once. There were objections. They were answered. If one spares the transportation lattice, military evacuation becomes possible. If one spares the data vaults, command continuity survives. If one spares food distribution, the state outlasts the fleet losses. If one spares the training institutions, the next generation of officers is merely delayed. The language remained technical. That was part of the obscenity. The first major habitat siege began around a Kalari orbital megacity called Serev Bastion. It housed naval administration, munitions design teams, civilian families, agricultural reservoirs, schools, archives, and one of the species' finest symphonic halls. Human commanders did not crack it open with overwhelming bombardment. They did something colder. They sealed it. Power transfer arrays were disabled in patterns designed to preserve enough baseline function to prolong rather than swiftly end life support failure. Cargo approaches were mined. Solar collection panels were shattered in partial grids, leaving whole districts competing for energy rerouted through emergency buses. Water purification modules were targeted selectively, so that contamination alarms would spread before true scarcity hit, creating panic that consumed reserves faster than physical need required. For 41 days, Serev Bastion died by calculation. Families huddled in warmed storage rooms while the gravity fluctuated. Hospitals chose which wards to maintain. Civilian networks begged for surrender authorization that military administrators refused to grant. Human channels broadcast terms, timetables, and coolingly reasonable instructions for orderly compliance. When small craft attempted breakout, some were turned back, others were destroyed. Millions did not die in a single blaze. They suffocated slowly inside policy. On Carid Prime, a planet whose equatorial belt hosted a dense fusion of industrial manufacture and civilian population, humans used atmosphere-ignition munitions not to engulf continents, but to create traveling fire fronts through petrochemical zones feeding war production. The planners had precise models. They knew how heat would jump storage farms, transit depots, rail tubes, prefab housing blocks built for laborers. Hospital annexes, whose backup systems had already been compromised by electromagnetic strikes. The fires moved exactly as predicted. From orbit they looked like thin orange veins. On the ground they sounded like worlds ending. There were towns where people fled toward designated safety corridors only to discover that the corridors fed into transit choke points previously struck to slow military redeployment. The crush killed nearly as many as the flames. Human reconnaissance saw this happen. Some commanders redirected assets to open alternate lanes. Others held to original priorities because flexibility, they argued, risked prolonging the campaign. When the casualty reports reached human networks, public reaction split. Many recoiled. Many did not. A disturbing number said the Kalari had chosen this by beginning the war. And because these voices emerged from genuine grief, from people who still watched the Iliad footage with tears in their eyes, condemnation of them felt almost indecent. Food became the next weapon. Human fleets intercepted agricultural convoys across 7 Kalari systems and rerouted grain, nutrient gels, and protein cultures to controlled depots requiring local surrender codes for distribution. Regions whose administrators refused capitulation saw stores rot in sealed warehouses, while populations starved a few hundred kilometers away. On worlds with mixed loyalties, human information campaigns blamed local elites and were often correct, but accuracy did not soften the hunger. There were images, later taught in ethics seminars across the galaxy, of Kalari parents standing behind fences, made not to keep them in but to regulate access, holding children whose metabolic demands had outpaced available rations, while human drones hovered above delivering announcements about procedural compliance. Humanity had once condemned siege starvation as barbaric. Now it described it as coercive compression of conflict duration. There were refugee convoys. That phrase sounds cleaner than what it meant. After multiple urban collapses, waves of civilians flooded toward spaceports and emergency launch facilities. Human planners anticipated this. Some routes were left open deliberately in order to concentrate movement into surveilled lanes. Vast convoys of overloaded civilian craft climbed into orbit under failing transponders and limited fuel margins, carrying families, the elderly, teachers, artists, technicians, nursery workers, retired officers, black marketeers, small criminals, infants born during bombardment, and all the ordinary humanly irreducible contents of a population in flight. Military units used some of these convoys as cover. That much was true. Human response was to treat many convoys as militarily contaminated, unless proven otherwise. Interdiction squadrons halted columns of civilian vessels and sorted them over days or weeks. In some cases, ships were redirected to managed camps on barren moons. In others, they were stripped of navigation capability and parked in cold clusters until inspection teams arrived. Life support failures during these holding periods killed thousands. When escorts attempted resistance, human fire passed through the civilian formations with enough discrimination to satisfy tactical requirements and enough collateral damage to ensure that afterward no one cared about the distinction. One transport captain, later court-martialed by a human tribunal established after the war, described a convoy engagement in private testimony. She had locked missiles onto a Kalari corvette hiding among refugee barges and delayed for 9 seconds because children were visible in thermal contrast against the hulls around it. Her superior ordered immediate fire. She obeyed. The corvette died. So did 6 barges. I remember feeling relief afterward, she said. Not because they died, because the hesitation was over, because the decision had been made and I didn't have to be the one carrying uncertainty anymore. That was the sickness spreading through human ranks and civilian spectators alike. Violence reduced complexity. It created direction. It soothed the humiliation of helpless grief by replacing it with motion. Boarding operations deepened the stain. Kalari military doctrine relied on embedding command and technical cadres within civilian habitats once orbital superiority was lost. Human Marines responded with compartment-by-compartment clearing actions through spinning stations where gravity flickered, lights failed, and every closed door might conceal a family, a machine shop, or a fire team. Distinction between combatant and civilian became a matter of seconds. Silhouettes, posture, heat signatures, imperfect translation, and exhausted nerves. People were stunned, restrained, searched, moved, misidentified, shot, trampled, left without medical follow-up because the tactical timetable would not pause. Airlocks filled with bodies because there was nowhere else to store them. Entire residential spines were vented after sensors detected weapons traces that later proved to have originated in only 3 apartments. Human Marines wrote home about the work using the language of necessity. Then, more troublingly, some wrote about it using the language of meaning. A former architecture student serving in assault logistics told his sister, "For the first time in my life I understand what all the old stories meant. I know exactly what I'm for. I hate that I needed this to know." At home, those messages circulated privately and then publicly. They were discussed with a mixture of pride, fear, and fascination. Crowds gathered in civic halls and domestic lounges to watch strategic feeds the way prior ages had watched sport. Casualty maps updated in real time. Commentators, some responsible, some obscene, discussed whether certain industrial belts should be rendered permanently non-viable. Musicians composed requiems timed to offensive phases. Sculptors built memorials that blurred grief with exultation. A philosopher who warned that a civilization can become addicted to righteous fury found her lectures less popular than a tactical analyst, explaining how pressure deprivation curves inside sealed habitats forced surrender. The Kalari, for their part, doubled down on the very traits that had led them here. Their elites withheld surrender authorization from civilian populations to preserve negotiating leverage. Military units hid in refugee structures and cultural sites. Their propaganda networks declared that human brutality merely proved Kalari doctrine correct, that compassion always curdled into domination once power was challenged. Some populations rallied, others cursed their leaders openly. Internal fractures deepened, but human pressure was so relentless that these fractures rarely had time to become organized resistance from within. Whole financial systems were erased. Human cyber and physical strikes together targeted data vaults, account lattices, inheritance registries, supply prediction engines, and manufacturing coordination hubs. They did not merely disrupt military communications. They collapsed social memory. Savings vanished. Deeds vanished. Medical manufacturing recipes vanished. Food inventory chains desynchronized so badly that some regions starved while others drowned in spoiled surplus no one could root in time. Generations of accumulated continuity disappeared in hours. Economists later called it social decapitation. Survivors used simpler terms. They said the humans made the future stop. That phrase haunted human policymakers after the war because it was so close to what the Kelari bioweapon had done on Iliad. Not the same method, the same moral shape. During the height of the campaign, many humans could not see that similarity clearly enough. They were too deep inside the current. The current felt like purpose. It appeared in small domestic moments. A mother watching siege updates while her child slept in a warm room and realizing she was calmer during offensive days than during ceasefire rumors. A historian startled to find herself disappointed when negotiations seemed possible because peace threatened to bring back the old diffuse emptiness. A surgeon who volunteered for frontline triage because the work finally made each hour feel weighted and therefore livable. None of these people were monsters in the simplistic sense. That was what made the period so dangerous. They were grieving, frightened, intelligent, morally articulate people who had discovered that revenge and responsibility and relief could fuse into one hot alloy in the chest until separating them felt impossible. The first real cracks in the collective certainty came through images too ordinary to be assimilated into grand narrative. A drone operator over Kared Prime watched a strike package destroy a water distribution node tagged as dual use because reserve military stores were hidden in the sublevels. Hours later, reviewing post-strike thermal scans, he saw civilians emerging from underground tunnels carrying containers. They clustered around the broken mains. When secondary detonations from damaged infrastructure rippled outward, the people scattered and then, after a few minutes, returned. He zoomed in. No uniforms. No weapons, just thirst. He authorized the next strike because the system still fed military sectors downstream. That night he replayed the footage without tactical overlays and found himself nauseated by how much the containers resembled old ceramic jugs from Earth archaeology museums. His mind, desperate and cruel, had translated alien desperation into something recognizably human only after the order was complete. A Marine lieutenant on a rotating habitat kicked in a maintenance hatch and found not insurgents but a hidden nursery improvised by civilian technicians. The children inside had been taught to be silent during sweeps. One of them reached toward her armor not in fear, but because a heat vent on her chest plate reminded him of the only functioning heater they had. She called for medics. Then she moved on to clear the next corridor because there was still gunfire ahead. Later she would remember not the firefight, but the small hand patting warmed metal. A logistics analyst reviewing population displacement metrics discovered that one moon designated as a temporary refugee sink no longer had enough functioning scrubbers to support projected intake. She raised the issue. The response chain stalled. Another offensive phase took precedence. By the time the correction was approved, thousands had already died from compounded environmental failure. She had never killed anyone directly. She resigned during the war and spent the next 30 years helping rebuild air systems on former Kalari colonies, because she considered each repaired scrubber a sentence in a confession too long to finish. Still, the war ground on. Momentum is not merely strategic. It is emotional and social. Once a civilization has arranged its grief around action, stopping feels like moral theft. Every death already endured begins to demand justification through completion. Each new atrocity by one's own side is processed not as a reason to halt, but as proof that halting would render previous suffering meaningless. This is one of the oldest traps in history. It remains effective because it does not feel like a trap while one is inside it. Humanity's realization required a mirror large enough to reflect not a single incident, but the shape of the whole. That mirror arrived in stages. The first stage was the migration cluster at Vey Cross. After 3 major fleet defeats, Kelari military authorities abandoned civilian escape traffic from 6 systems and used the confusion to cover a partial strategic retreat. Thousands upon thousands of civilian vessels, from school transports to freight tubs to private yachts stripped for life support capacity, converged at Veii Cross, a dead junction around a cold star where pre-war trade lanes intersected. They had little fuel, almost no coordination, and nowhere safe to go. Some still carried local administrative signals. Most did not. A few Kelari destroyers moved within the mass as shielded escorts, and then, when human interdiction forces arrived, accelerated away at maximum burn, leaving the civilians behind like chaff. Human fleets emerged around the cluster, in concentric arcs of impossible firepower. Targeting solutions bloomed. War doctrine argued that the formation was militarily compromised. Any delay risked allowing hidden assets to break through. Interdiction, sorting, containment, and if necessary destructive reduction were all authorized options. Command channels filled with calculations, missile dispersal models, boarding rotation estimates, acceptable casualty projections, fuel use arguments, legal citations, moral justifications, tactical impatience. Then someone streamed external visual feeds directly into the broader civilian network back in human space. No overlays, no labels, no doctrine. Just thousands of dim civilian craft adrift against a cold star, many running on emergency light. Some had painted identification marks across their hulls by hand. Some flashed improvised surrender patterns. Through magnification, viewers could see people crowding windows. Some held signs in languages humans could translate, and some in languages they could not. The messages were all variations on the same plea. Children visible, medical emergency, no weapons, please. At almost the same time, a documentary collective released a long-form reconstruction of the Iliad attack built from recovered feeds, local testimony, and archived messages from dead-hand workers. It ended not with the fire or the bodies, but with hours of ordinary footage recorded in the weeks before the atrocity. Humans laughing while carrying stone through wet terraces, local farmers arguing over crop channels, Terran teaching children how to wrap a bandage, Mara asleep against a storage crate after a flood shift, boots muddy, face peaceful with useful exhaustion. Then his final message. Please don't let this make us forget who we are. Civilization watched both streams in the same day. The contrast was unbearable. For the first time on a truly mass scale, humans saw not only what had been done to them, but what they had become while answering it. Not in abstract casualty reports, in shape, in posture, in the mirrored helplessness of civilians waiting beneath superior power while a distant enemy debated their statistical value. The emotional structure of the war cracked. Grief was still there, rage was still there, but many humans now recognized within their own wartime intensity another ingredient they had refused to name honestly enough: relief transmuted into appetite. The campaign had not merely avenged, it had provided. It had given a tired civilization focus, narrative, urgency, simplified moral weather. It had felt good to know where to direct oneself. It had felt good, in ways too many had sanctified because admitting that would have endangered the righteousness sustaining them. Scholars and psychologists had been warning of this for months, but warnings become audible only when a society is ready to hear the thing it already suspects. Public forums exploded. Veterans spoke with shaking voices about exhilaration they no longer trusted. Civilians admitted that days with major offensives had become easier to live inside than quiet days. Priests, atheists, historians, labor organizers, artists, military ethicists, handworkers, and grief counselors all reached for language that could hold both truths at once. What the Kelari had done was monstrous, and what humanity had done in response had become monstrous too. Not equivalent in origin. Equivalent enough in some outcomes to be unbearable. Command networks mirrored the fracture. Some officers demanded total victory, arguing that any pause would embolden future predators and dishonor the dead of Iliad. Others said the dead of Iliad were already being dishonored every hour the campaign relied on starvation, habitat suffocation, and civilian sorting as routine tools. Tactical AIs returned branching probabilities for continued war, controlled drawdown, negotiated reconstruction, punitive occupation, sector partition. None could answer the question that now mattered most. At what point does justice become an alibi for addiction? Mara, who had survived because she had been off-world when Iliad burned, spoke before a public ethics assembly from a reconstruction depot where she had been treating bioweapon sequelae in children who would never have siblings. She looked exhausted and older than her age. Behind her, in the clinic corridor, former Kalari refugees waited beside former victims of Kalari attack because disease does not honor rhetoric. "I wanted them hurt," she said. "I still do sometimes. I wanted them to know fear. I wanted them to lose what they took from us. I wanted all of that, and then I watched us become organized around wanting, not around protection, not around rescue, around the wanting itself. We told ourselves the feeling in our chests was moral certainty. Some of it was grief. Some of it was duty. Some of it was relief that life had become sharp again. We fed all of it together until we couldn't tell which part was steering." She paused and took a breath. "Terran didn't ask us not to fight. He asked us not to forget. We forgot." Within 40 hours of that address, the war ended. Not through treaty, not through victory ceremony, not through collapse of the last Kalari fleet, though plenty of force remained available to complete that project. Human Command issued a unilateral cessation order across all active theaters. Some captains demanded confirmation because the timing seemed absurd. Some offensive packages were already in final approach. Some boarding teams were mid-corridor. A few commanders hesitated long enough to generate later legal review, but the order held. Weapons went cold. Siege perimeters opened humanitarian corridors. Interdiction lines converted into rescue grids. A single statement moved out through every lattice the galaxy possessed. "We remember why we began. We no longer remember why we continue." The silence afterward was heavier than battle. There was no triumph in it, no relief pure enough to feel clean. Human populations that had lived in a fever of purpose for months or years, depending on theater timing, suddenly found themselves standing amid the emotional wreckage of that purpose. Grief returned, but altered now by shame. The old ennui lurked at the edge of awareness, and many feared it, because they now understood too well what could happen when a listless civilization discovered that violence cured numbness quickly. The Kalari were not destroyed. That fact mattered strategically and morally. Their central war-making capacity had been broken. Their regional supremacy was shattered. Large sectors of their infrastructure lay in ruins. Population losses were horrific. Fertility damage from their own bioweapons had rebounded through contaminated chains and sabotage. Political elites fell, some to internal coups, some to captured tribunals, some to obscurity in the chaos. But the species survived. Its children survived. Its language survived. Its songs survived where archives had not. Enough remained for history to continue, which is not a small mercy. Humanity's next task was harder than war, because it lacked war's intoxications. It had to look. Reconstruction teams entered worlds and habitats they themselves had broken. The records they created later transformed interstellar ethics because they were meticulous, public, and impossible to romanticize. Habitat sectors where families had died in sealed rooms around dead heating units. Agricultural belts where malnutrition had stunted entire age cohorts. Hospital vaults whose medicine printers had gone cold because supply algorithms were gone, and no one alive could reconstruct them from memory. Moon camps where environmental control lag had turned waiting civilians into statistics before anyone in command felt enough urgency to care. Humans documented all of it. They also rebuilt. The same species that had cut transport lines now restored them. The same engineering corps that had sabotaged water cycles now repaired irrigation under supervision from local survivors who often hated them and were allowed to say so. Human medics treated Kalari children suffering from diseases unleashed by war collapse. Human agricultural specialists resurrected seed libraries from off-world backups and from remembered fragments carried by refugees who had once cursed the sight of human ships. No one pretended this erased anything. That honesty was the beginning of redemption. Redemption, in the years that followed, became less a narrative than a labor discipline inside human culture. Memorials expanded beyond the dead of Iliad and the murdered hand workers. There were memorials now for the suffocated in Serev Bastion, for those who died in ration lines, for the civilians burned in the industrial belts, for the families lost in convoy sorting failures, for the unnamed because naming had sometimes been made impossible by the very date of destruction humans had imposed. Some objected bitterly. They argued that such memorials weakened deterrence, diluted the moral clarity of the original Kalari crime, equated victim and aggressor. The debate remained fierce for decades. But enough of humanity had looked long enough to know that clarity which depends on selective vision is not moral clarity at all. It is merely a cleaner costume for old appetites. Institutions changed. Not centralized institutions, because the galaxy still had no council and humanity itself remained allergic to formal imperial structure, but distributed norms hardened. Human fleets remained active, though under more layered oversight than before. Atrocity response protocols were rewritten to prioritize evacuation and shielding before punitive action. Siege starvation was placed under the strongest interdictions human legal culture could devise short of self-amputation. Officers and civilian coordinators alike underwent training not just in proportionality, but in the psychology of purposive violence, the way relief and grief can fuse, the seduction of feeling finally useful at the expense of someone else's future. Every young human learned some version of the story, and not the flattering version. On reconstructed worlds, mandatory service became common. Not military service, though some chose that. Rebuilding service, environmental restoration, medical outreach, archive recovery. Human adolescents who might once have drifted through a century of cultivated leisure spent years in damaged systems helping lay water pipe, restore data meshes, or translate oral histories from communities whose archives had burned. They worked beside descendants of those humanity had harmed. Sometimes friendships formed, sometimes resentment endured, both were allowed. Mara stayed in the outreach networks the rest of her life. She returned to Iliad when the wetlands had partially recovered. The old terraces were gone, remade by flood and war and reconstruction. New ones stepped across the lowlands, their geometry altered to account for the bioweapon's long ecological tail. The farmer who had once asked whether humanity had too much comfort was dead. His grandson, grown now, met her in the rain. For a long while, they just worked in the mud together. Finally, he said, "My grandfather used to say your people came here because you wanted to be tired for a reason you could touch." Mara kept placing stones. He wasn't wrong. The grandson looked out over the water, and now. She considered the question carefully. Now we do this because some reasons stay in your hands even after you wish they wouldn't. The galaxy adapted as galaxies do. Not all at once, not cleanly, but memory changed behavior. Powers that might once have toyed with demonstrative atrocity thought again when they considered what human intervention looked like even at its worst, because surviving under the quiet species, wrath had become a foundational fear across several sectors. At the same time, surviving under that wrath had also taught the galaxy that humanity's most dangerous trait was not simple strength. It was depth. The depth of feeling they could bring to bear once stirred from long stagnation, and the scale at which that feeling could organize material power. This made them both deterrent and cautionary tale. There still was no council. Several species proposed one after the war, often with humanity in some stabilizing role. Humanity refused formal centrality every time. Too many humans had come to distrust the pleasure of necessity. Too many understood how quickly we must becomes a narcotic. Instead, the galaxy developed stronger customs, faster atrocity signaling networks, distributed evidence vaults impossible to erase in one strike, mutual evacuation compacts, shared archive redundancies. More species accepted human outreach presence, though often with explicit local authority built into agreements. The hand workers grew from a subculture into something closer to a civilizational ethic. Not universal, but dominant enough that service, repair, and difficult presence replaced much of the old languid prestige economy of human abundance. The old ennui never fully vanished. That was perhaps the most honest part of the aftermath. Humanity did not solve itself through guilt any more than it had solved itself through comfort. There were still orbital cities where people stared out across impossible beauty and felt the old ache. There were still artists obsessed with emptiness, thrill seekers chasing consequence, thinkers asking whether a species built for struggle could remain healthy after mastering survival. But now those questions existed, alongside memory vivid enough to keep easy answers from becoming fashionable. In orbit above a former Kalari industrial world, human warships still drifted decades later, dark and silent against the stars. They did not dominate local life. They did not intervene in ordinary governance. They mostly watched. Their presence was an admission as much as a threat, a reminder that history had happened here and that forgetting is not the same as healing. On the surface below, one could find an agricultural cooperative where human and Kalari workers rebuilt soil chemistry ruined by atmospheric burns. The Kalari still moved with the disciplined posture of their ancestors, though less often with the old triumphal certainty. Human volunteers there learned the local language badly and were corrected without much mercy. Children of both species attended the same practical schools, where engineering was taught alongside ethics, and where archive studies included footage from Iliad, Serev Bastion, Vey Cross, and 100 smaller places history might once have ignored. One spring season, a teacher asked a mixed classroom why the galaxy had no council. A Kalari child answered, "Because everyone wants too much." A human child answered, "Because no one trusts power." A third, from a species nearly erased in a different conflict and rebuilt largely by human outreach, said, "Because talking is slower than ruling, and slow can save lives." The teacher, who had seen war firsthand, told them all that they were partly right. Human veterans aged under a weight their ancestors would have recognized. Some withdrew into quiet work and said little. Some became historians, determined that no future generation would inherit a cleaned-up version. Some could not bear peace because peace gave them back the old hollowness and stripped away war's terrible clarity. Those were the hardest to help. Civilization had to learn, with embarrassing lateness, that one can become dependent not only on violence itself, but on the sensation of finally feeling necessary. Treatment programs emerged, distributed as everything else in human society tended to be. They were not only for soldiers. Civilians came too: drone operators, analysts, commentators, families who missed the certainty of wartime outrage and hated themselves for missing it. Therapy in that era often began with the same question: when did the pain become simpler than the emptiness? No single answer ever sufficed. There were tribunals. Not enough, some argued. Too many, others claimed. Kalari leaders were tried for the initiating atrocity where evidence survived intact, and some human commanders, logisticians, and officials faced judgment for actions during the retaliatory campaign. Most of these proceedings avoided the theater that interstellar justice often preferred. There were no easy villains by the end, and no courtroom could hold all of history's weather. Still, they mattered, because public acknowledgement matters even when proportional punishment is impossible. A human admiral testified about Serev Bastion and said, We thought prolonged pressure would break military resolve while preserving structural assets for reconstruction. That is how we phrased it. We turned slow civilian death into an engineering advantage and hid from ourselves inside vocabulary. That sentence entered common usage in ethics education. Hide from yourself inside vocabulary. It described too much of civilized violence across too many species. As the generations turned, some Kalari communities developed a grim respect for humanity that resembled the old fear but was no longer identical to it. They had seen the quiet species at their worst and then seen them stay. Stay through disease, famine recovery, archive reconstruction, school building, sewage maintenance, trauma care, and long, awkward attempts at coexistence. To a culture raised on the belief that strength and compassion could not inhabit the same body without one corrupting the other, this was bewildering. A Kalari historian writing 70 years after the war summarized it in a line that circulated widely. They proved our doctrine wrong twice, first by becoming monsters, then by refusing to remain them. That, more than any treaty, altered the shape of the future. One evening near the end of Mara's life, long after the wetlands of Iliad had stabilized, and the children there no longer reacted to thunder as if it might be bombardment, she sat outside a rebuilt clinic and watched the sky darken into the colors unique to that world. Beside her sat a young human volunteer just out of training, all earnestness and uncertainty, hands still blistered from manual labor. "Did we earn any of it back?" the volunteer asked eventually. Mara knew what she meant: not territory, not prestige, the right to keep calling themselves what they had once thought they were. "I don't know," she said. The volunteer looked stricken, perhaps expecting wisdom with cleaner edges. Mara smiled faintly. "I don't know if that's how this works. I think earning it back suggests there's a point where the ledger closes and everyone agrees the balance has changed. I don't think grief works that way. I don't think guilt does either." "Then why keep doing this?" She looked out over the fields where workers moved in the dimness, laying the last lines of a new irrigation branch with hand tools, because the local cooperative preferred to understand every joint by touch before turning full automation loose on it. Fireflies, or the Iliadi equivalent, drifted above the water. "Because it still needs doing," she said. "Because some part of being who we are is not what we felt in the best moment or the worst moment, but what we choose after understanding both. Because if we stop, comfort will tell us another lie about ourselves. And because when I'm tired for the right reasons, I can hear the dead without needing them to forgive me." The volunteer sat with that a long while. The galaxy still had no council. It still had arguments, trade, local wars, foolish powers, generous ones, species that mistook restraint for weakness, and species that mistook violence for proof. It still had memory, though, and memory had grown teeth. Humanity remained what it had always been in the eyes of others: difficult to map, impossible to categorize neatly, present in the background of repair and catastrophe alike. But after the war with the Kalari, no one confused quiet with harmlessness again. And among humans themselves, the old question of purpose no longer floated above life in the abstract. It had been dragged through mud and ash and sealed habitats and starving camps and reconstruction fields. They knew now, with a painful intimacy, that purpose could be found in destruction just as surely as in service, and that the first often announced itself more vividly than the second. So they built cultures meant to prefer the quieter labor. They rebuilt water systems before they built monuments. They taught archive redundancy before strategy. They made young people work with their hands. They planted forests on bomb-scarred continents. They restored songs in languages their fleets had once tried to silence through collateral ruin. They kept their warships because innocence was gone and would not be dishonestly reassembled. But they parked those ships where everyone could see them, including themselves. Reminders, not idols. Warnings, not ambitions. Hope returned, slowly and without spectacle. It returned in mixed classrooms, in repaired transit lines, in local harvest festivals where human volunteers were tolerated with increasing warmth, in shared jokes that would have been impossible a generation earlier, in clinics where former enemies donated blood to former enemies because blood, once outside the body, does not remember doctrine. It returned with grief still braided through it. That was the price of mature hope. It no longer believed itself clean. Under alien suns and within the artificial dawns of their own ancient habitats, humans carried that hope carefully. They carried it with dirty hands, with old stories, with tribunal transcripts, with the names of their dead and the names of those they had killed. They carried it like something breakable and dangerous and necessary. The quiet species still shaped the galaxy. Now they did so knowing exactly how much of civilization depends on what one chooses to do, after discovering that the hunger for meaning can wear the face of mercy just as easily as the face of war.